cold wind sweeps across the Potomac. Factories stand silent, iron bones waiting for purpose. In Washington, D.C., the air is heavy with doubt. The world beyond the Atlantic burns. Poland has fallen, France trembles. Over Europe, the Luftwaffe rules the sky, sleek, fast, merciless. Inside the White House, Franklin D. Roosevelt studies a report. America's entire air fleet, fighters, bombers, trainers, barely exceeds 3,000 planes. Across the ocean, Germany has 10 times that. Roosevelt lifts his pen, signs a document, and makes a promise that sounds like madness. 300,000 aircraft, built not in decades, in 4 years. In Berlin, Nazi officials laugh. Goebbels calls it American propaganda, the wishful boasting of a decaying democracy. German newspapers echo the same. To them, industrial miracles belong only to dictatorships, not to a divided republic still crawling out of depression. But behind Roosevelt's quiet resolve lies something unseen, a nation about to awaken. Factories will roar, workers will flood in, and steel will take flight. In early 1940, the United States stood at a crossroads between isolation and inevitability. The Great Depression had hollowed out its confidence. Millions were still jobless, factories idle, budgets slashed. The scars of the First World War ran deep. A generation lost in muddy trenches had convinced America that Europe's wars were not its concern. Congress reflected that fear. Military budgets were trimmed, arms production restricted, and neutrality laws kept industry leashed. Yet overseas, the storm gathered strength. Hitler's armies were rolling unchecked through Europe. The Blitzkrieg, that fusion of tanks, aircraft, and speed, had redefined war itself. Entire nations collapsed in weeks. To Roosevelt, the pattern was unmistakable. The United States was next in line, if not on the battlefield, then in the realm of survival itself. The Army Air Corps, America's aerial arm, was a shadow force. Pilots trained in outdated planes. Engines sputtered. Spare parts were scavenged. A few thousand aircraft sat grounded or obsolete, incapable of matching Germany's Messerschmitts or Heinkels. Industrial capacity existed, dormant, but it lacked direction. The nation had the raw material, the workers, the energy, but not yet the vision to unite them. Roosevelt understood something his critics did not. Wars were no longer won on battlefields alone. They were won in foundries, assembly lines, and drafting rooms. In May 1940, after France's collapse, he addressed the nation in a tone calm but unyielding. "We must be the great arsenal of democracy," he declared. Those words, broadcast through static-filled radios, reached every workshop and kitchen in America. Still, skepticism prevailed. Business leaders accused him of overreach. Isolationists called him a warmonger. Newspapers mocked the 300,000 planes figure as political theater. Even his closest advisors urged moderation, fearing that the goal would expose the administration to ridicule. But Roosevelt persisted. He knew the number was not merely arithmetic, it was psychological warfare. A declaration to enemies and allies alike that the United States would not remain asleep. Behind the scenes, quiet preparations began. The Office of Production Management was formed. Contracts flowed to companies that had never built an airplane before. Automobile manufacturers, Ford, General Motors, Chrysler, were asked to imagine wings instead of wheels. Henry Ford, skeptical at first, agreed to an experiment, a plant that could mass-produce bombers as efficiently as cars. The idea would later become the Willow Run assembly line, the arsenal of democracy made real. Engineers began redrawing the industrial landscape. Machine tools were standardized, training programs accelerated, women and minorities were slowly, reluctantly brought into the labor force. Every bolt, every rivet became part of a larger design. America was not yet at war, but it was learning to think like a nation that soon would be. Still, in 1940, it was all blueprint and hope. Across the Atlantic, German intelligence reports mocked the notion of large-scale U.S. rearmament. Their agents described American factories as uncoordinated, peacetime workshops. Goering himself dismissed the prospect, declaring that the Americans build cars, not bombers. But Roosevelt's promise was not a boast. It was a signal to the engineers, the workers, the industrialists. that the time for disbelief was over. Production was to become a form of combat. Every machine built was a weapon forged before the first shot fired. By late 1940, government inspectors walked the floors of auto plants, measuring, sketching, and calculating what transformation would require. The US was still neutral, still at peace, yet the hum of reawakening industry was unmistakable. Sparks began to fly again in Michigan, California, and Ohio. Aluminum supplies were stockpiled, tool and die shops expanded, aircraft designers tested prototypes in wind tunnels, their eyes fixed not on elegance but efficiency. The air itself seemed to change, charged with a quiet urgency. Roosevelt had drawn a line between doubt and determination. The clock was ticking and the war machine was stirring, and as the months passed, that awakening began to spread beyond industry, into hearts, into homes, into the national identity itself. Across the Atlantic, Germany's air fleets moved like clockwork. The Luftwaffe, under Hermann Goering, was at its zenith. From the ashes of Versailles, Hitler's regime had built the most advanced air arm in the world. Stuka dive bombers screamed across Europe, terrorizing cities and columns alike. Messerschmitt Bf-109s ruled the skies. To most observers, the war had proven one thing: industrial might, when fused with ideological discipline, could crush nations. The Battle of Britain had shown what air power alone could achieve, and what limits even it could not surpass. The British held on by inches, but their survival came at immense cost. The Luftwaffe's dominance still loomed. Across German headquarters, the belief solidified. No democracy could mobilize fast enough to match their machine. American intelligence reports trickled in with growing alarm. By 1940, Germany had produced over 20,000 combat aircraft. The US Army Air Corps had roughly 3,000, many obsolete. Its bomber force was almost symbolic. Pilots trained in open fields, sometimes painting their aircraft with makeshift insignia. Training hours were rationed due to fuel shortages. Logistics were primitive. Spare engines had to be shipped from one base to another just to keep squadrons aloft. Industrial leaders, meanwhile, struggled to comprehend the scale of Roosevelt's demand. The aircraft industry in the US was fragmented. Boeing produced heavy bombers, Lockheed worked on long-range reconnaissance aircraft, North American Aviation on fighters. But each plant was limited by its pre-war scale. Most had never mass-produced beyond a few hundred units per year. To leap from thousands to hundreds of thousands was beyond precedent. Still, Roosevelt's administration pressed forward. In July 1940, Britain signed the Destroyers for Bases deal, a signal that America's neutrality was eroding. The following year, the Lend-Lease Act would make it official. American factories would feed the Allied war effort long before American troops entered the field. Every tank, every plane, every truck sent abroad would serve two purposes: to fight fascism and to train American industry in the art of limitless production. This quiet transformation was as much psychological as mechanical. American engineers began studying the German model, the centralized war economy, the integration of state control with private enterprise, and then reinvented it in their own image. Rather than total command, they pursued coordination. The government would set the targets, industry would find the means. It was capitalism turned into mobilization, guided by vision, not decree. And the numbers began to shift. In 1940, US aircraft production barely surpassed 6,000 planes. In 1941, that number doubled. Factories were retooled, workers retrained. Civilian aviation firms merged or expanded under government direction. The aviation industry's labor force tripled within 18 months. Aluminum output skyrocketed as new smelters rose across the nation. The auto industry learned to think in wingspans and propellers. Still, the disbelief in Berlin remained. German propagandists mocked American industry as chaotic and undisciplined. Reports circulated through the Nazi hierarchy claiming that American workers lacked the endurance and obedience required for sustained wartime production. Goering sneered at Roosevelt's 300,000 plane pledge, calling it another American dream, paper and noise. But in the shadows of Detroit and Seattle, that dream was turning to blueprint, and blueprint to reality. Machine tools hummed day and night. The first great aircraft factories began to rise: Fort Worth, Long Beach, Willow Run. Each one larger than anything the world had seen. When the Japanese struck Pearl Harbor in December 1941, America's shift from preparation to total war became irreversible. Overnight, doubt turned to fury. Congress declared war, and the arsenal of democracy moved from concept to command. Roosevelt's propaganda number became a national mission. Men enlisted. Women took the jobs they'd been told they could never do. Engineers worked through nights. The air was filled with sparks, smoke, and urgency. By 1942, the transformation was visible from coast to coast. America was no longer a sleeping giant. It was awake, angry, and building wings at a speed that defied calculation. The era of hesitation had ended. The race to outbuild tyranny had begun. America's transformation was not driven by generals or politicians alone. It was built by hands, millions of them. Ordinary men and women who had never seen an airplane up close suddenly became its architects. In 1941, factory gates opened before dawn. Streams of workers poured in. Farmers' sons, steel workers, mechanics, women carrying lunch pails and photographs of sons already at war. They learned quickly, guided by blueprints that seemed almost alien. Each bolt tightened, each rivet struck, was an act of defiance against despair. Women took over machines once thought too heavy for them. Rosie the Riveter became more than propaganda. She was the living face of America's industrial miracle. African-American workers, often segregated and underpaid, began to find positions in the war plants, still fighting discrimination yet essential to output. Across every factory floor, the rhythm of production became a unifying language. The shift schedules were relentless, 6 days a week, 12-hour days, holidays erased. But morale remained high, fueled not by ideology but by purpose. The war wasn't just fought overseas, it was waged here, through noise, dust, and exhaustion. The transformation of the American worker was itself revolutionary. Pre-war unemployment evaporated. By 1943, nearly 20 million new jobs had been created through war industry. For the first time, women made up more than a third of the industrial labor force. Every small town became a reservoir of skill. The machinist in Kansas, the welder in Detroit, the seamstress in Seattle, together they became the unseen front line. Each plane built was a story of perseverance. Families tracked their work across oceans, a B-17 built in Seattle flying over Berlin, a P-51 Mustang assembled in Inglewood, escorting bombers across Europe. Workers began marking the metal with chalk, initials, prayers, the names of loved ones lost in earlier battles. The machinery became humanized, alive with sentiment and resolve. The war had taken America's labor and turned it into something greater, a force bound by purpose, not fear. And that unity, once forged, would not easily fade. Industrial alchemy defined the American miracle. The nation that built cars and washing machines turned overnight into an empire of wings and engines. Every company, from the smallest tool shop to the largest automaker, became a cog in an aerial revolution. The centerpiece of this transformation was the concept of mass production for complexity. Aircraft were delicate machines, traditionally built by hand in small numbers. America changed that forever. At Boeing, assembly lines stretched through cavernous halls where the B-17 flying fortress took shape under blinding lights. Each stage of production, fuselage, wings, engines, armament, was divided into repeatable tasks, synchronized like clockwork. Ford's Willow Run plant was the ultimate experiment. Conceived in 1941, it aimed to build the B-24 Liberator heavy bomber, an aircraft with over 1 million parts, as efficiently as a Model T. Skeptics laughed, but by 1944, Willow Run was rolling out one completed B-24 every 63 minutes. The factory itself was a city, 5 million square feet of steel, glass, and noise. Workers joked that a man could start walking at dawn from one end and still be inside by noon. Lockheed's P-38 Lightning, North American's P-51 Mustang, and Douglas's C-47 Transport became industrial icons. Each one represented a lesson learned in speed, scale, and precision. Aircraft production soared from 6,000 in 1940 to 96,000 in 1944, a 16-fold increase. At breakneck pace, cycling drives as part of school programs. Rubber, copper, and steel were rationed. Synthetic substitutes were invented within months, bypassing years of normal research. The war turned laboratories into battlefields of innovation. This technological storm wasn't chaotic, it was orchestrated. Roosevelt's administration had learned to balance control and freedom. The government provided contracts, deadlines, and materials. Industry handled execution. The War Production Board coordinated thousands of subcontractors across all 48 states. By 1943, 2,000 companies were building aircraft components, wings in California, engines in Ohio, landing gear in Texas, all converging in final assembly lines that never slept. The hum of production became the new sound of war. By the time American bombers filled the skies over Europe, every rivet had a story, every flight a lineage of human and mechanical genius fused together. At the center of this transformation stood Franklin D. Roosevelt, a leader accused of dreaming beyond reason. When he set the target of 300,000 aircraft, even his military advisors considered it delusional. But Roosevelt understood that in a war of machines, imagination was a weapon. His leadership was not about details, it was about direction. He surrounded himself with industrialists, economists, and engineers rather than soldiers. He empowered Donald Nelson, a Sears executive turned production chief, to head the War Production Board. Nelson's authority extended across industries. His task, remove bottlenecks, eliminate waste, and keep factories alive around the clock. Roosevelt's genius lay in persuasion. He didn't command industry, he inspired it. His speeches were calm, deliberate, unshaken. He framed production not as obligation but destiny. We must outbuild them, outproduce them, outthink them, he said. To workers that became scripture. Behind closed doors his strategy was pragmatic. He used public disbelief to his advantage, forcing companies to prove him right. He played rivals against each other, Lockheed against Boeing, Ford against Douglas, driving competition that birthed innovation. He also shielded the war economy from panic. When setbacks came, material shortages, logistical collapses, factory accidents, Roosevelt's tone never changed. He projected inevitability, even when chaos loomed. That steadiness infected his nation. And beneath his leadership, a new form of warfare was emerging, one fought not by divisions, but by blueprints and belief. From his office, Roosevelt could not hear the roar of factories, but he knew that somewhere in that thunder lay America's future wings. The industrial miracle was taking shape. But to understand how this machinery translated into victory, one must see how America's enemies viewed it, and how disbelief became their downfall. Before America's surge, air warfare was still in its infancy. The Luftwaffe had perfected short-range domination, quick surgical strikes synchronized with ground assaults. Their Stukas supported tanks, their fighters maintained local control. It was a weapon of invasion. The United States envisioned something entirely different, a war of endurance fought through distance and depth. It wasn't about local superiority, it was about permanent dominance. To achieve that, America needed thousands of aircraft, not hundreds. As production surged, doctrine evolved. Long-range strategic bombing, once a theory debated in classrooms, became operational truth. The B-17 Flying Fortress, and later the B-24 Liberator, embodied this shift. These bombers didn't strike battlefields, they struck industries, power grids, transport lines, the skeletal structure of enemy strength. By 1943, U.S. tactical planning fused production with purpose. Each factory blueprint mirrored a military strategy. The 8th Air Force in Britain became the tip of this industrial spear, flying machines born from Detroit's precision and Boeing's discipline. Massed formations of bombers replaced the notion of small, elite squadrons. Efficiency replaced elegance. The sky itself became an assembly line, engines roaring, formations stretching horizon to horizon. Pilots weren't just flying, they were delivering the mechanical will of an entire nation. The doctrine was not flawless. Losses in 1943 were staggering, entire bomber groups destroyed over Schweinfurt and Regensburg. Yet production erased fear. Every plane lost was replaced, sometimes within days. German pilots began to notice a terrible pattern. For every squadron shot down, 2 more appeared. The Luftwaffe's veterans realized that victory in the air no longer depended on skill alone, but on supply. Tactics had met industry, and industry was winning. Inside Nazi command rooms, disbelief hardened into arrogance. Goering and his officers had grown accustomed to superiority. Their Luftwaffe had terrorized Europe. Their technology, training, and doctrine had been years ahead of every rival. When Roosevelt promised 300,000 aircraft, German analysts dismissed it as impossible. The United States, they reported, lacked the infrastructure, the workforce discipline, and the raw materials to sustain production. Their intelligence officers, observing America before Pearl Harbor, saw a disorganized nation of consumers, not warriors. Reports arriving in Berlin in 1942 painted a changing picture. New factories, extended rail networks, oil refining at unprecedented scales. But the Nazi hierarchy refused to believe the implications. Goering, whose ego anchored the Luftwaffe, saw every American announcement as propaganda. Let them talk, he reportedly sneered. They cannot build what they do not understand. By late 1943, disbelief turned to alarm. The skies over Europe began to shift color. The contrails of American bombers now stretched endlessly. Intercept reports became overwhelming. Every day more B-17s appeared. Every month, new fighter escorts extended their range deeper into German airspace. Intelligence divisions calculated that America was producing aircraft faster than Germany could destroy them. Still, Goering clung to illusion. He told his subordinates that quantity does not equal quality. But even that logic crumbled. The P-51 Mustang, product of American and British collaboration, began escorting bombers all the way to Berlin, in and back. The Luftwaffe's last strategic advantage, distance, was gone. German morale faltered not just in the air but in the mind. Propaganda had once mocked Roosevelt's promise. Now it could not explain the thunder overhead. Civilians began whispering about Roosevelt's machines, a phrase that once signified ridicule now used with fear. What Germany had dismissed as noise had become the sound of its own decline. The American aircraft program was more than engineering. It was moral assertion. Every rivet driven into metal was a declaration that democracy could organize itself under pressure without abandoning its principles. Dictatorships used compulsion. America used conviction. Roosevelt's call for 300,000 planes wasn't enforced by fear, but by pride. Citizens bought war bonds, joined scrap drives, worked overtime, and believed that their labor had meaning. The nation didn't just produce, it believed in production as proof of freedom's strength. The moral impact extended beyond borders. Allied nations, especially Britain and the Soviet Union, drew strength from America's example. British pilots flying American-built fighters spoke of the weight of an empire behind every engine. Soviet commanders credited U.S. aircraft shipments for stabilizing their front. The sight of endless supply ships arriving from across the Atlantic reshaped global morale. For Germany, it was the opposite. Every new wave of American bombers wasn't just a threat, it was humiliation. It revealed their propaganda's hollowness. Nazi ideology preached that democracies were weak, fragmented, and indulgent. Yet the indulgent nation now produced weapons faster than any totalitarian regime could imagine. The war of ideology had become a war of assembly lines. By 1944, Roosevelt's impossible number was no longer myth, it was mathematics. The US built 96,000 aircraft that year alone. Factories that had once doubted now operated around the clock, their walls vibrating under the sound of triumph and fatigue. To the world, the message was clear: freedom could outbuild fear. And as that truth took flight, the war's balance began to tilt, irrevocably. What began as disbelief was now reality, but the true test of Roosevelt's dream was still ahead. The moment when those machines met the battlefield and the industrial prophecy turned to fire and smoke. By 1942, the United States had crossed an invisible line, from preparation to momentum. The arsenal of democracy was no longer a slogan, it was a living organism. Its heartbeat was mechanical, its breath the hiss of steam and oil. Across the continent, the night glowed orange from furnaces that never cooled. Detroit, once the capital of cars, became a fortress of aviation. The Ford Willow Run plant roared day and night, its mile-long assembly lines churning out B-24 Liberators with relentless precision. The air smelled of metal and gasoline. Conveyor belts carried bombers in motion. Wings attached on one end, engines bolted on the other. paint sprayed in streaks of olive drab before sunrise. Each shift change looked like an army on the march, men and women filing in by the thousands, lunch pails clattering, boots echoing off concrete floors. Music played through tinny loudspeakers, not to entertain but to maintain rhythm. Efficiency was the new discipline. At Boeing's Seattle plant, rows of B-17 flying fortresses stood wingtip to wingtip, a forest of metal waiting for flight. Engineers moved beneath them like ants under trees. Every 12 minutes another bomber rolled toward daylight. Lockheed's P-38 Lightning, with its twin-boom design, became a symbol of engineering audacity. North American's P-51 Mustang, sleek, fast, perfect, was born of necessity and refined through obsession. Production numbers turned abstract. In 1940, the US built 6,000 planes. In 1941, 19,000. In 1942, 48,000. By the end of 1943, the figure crossed 86,000, more aircraft than all Axis powers combined. The PR omise of 300,000 was no longer fantasy. It was trajectory. Factories operated like battlegrounds of endurance. Managers slept in offices. Workers lived in boarding houses near production lines. Railroad lines carried parts non-stop from one state to another. A wing made in Ohio met a fuselage from California and an engine from Michigan, assembled, tested and flown east to the front lines. Each plane was born into war. The Atlantic and Pacific swallowed them whole. Within weeks of rollout, they thundered over North Africa, Sicily and the South Pacific. America's assembly lines were feeding global campaigns with terrifying efficiency. And across the ocean, the enemy began to feel the weight. In Berlin, alarms wailed daily. Daylight raids, once unthinkable, became routine. Waves of B-17s filled the horizon, escorted by swarms of Mustangs. From the ground, they looked endless, sunlight flashing off wings like mirrors of inevitability. The Luftwaffe fought back with fury. Their aces, veterans from Spain, France and the Eastern Front, rose to meet the challenge. At first, their precision cut deep. Schweinfurt, Regensburg, Bremen, missions that cost hundreds of bombers and thousands of lives. But with each loss, replacements came faster. Each destroyed bomber was rebuilt before its crew was even buried. Germany's aircraft production strained to keep pace. Factories in Augsburg, Regensburg and Marienburg were bombed relentlessly, supply chains fractured, aluminum shortages crippled assembly. The once proud Luftwaffe found itself drowning under numbers it could no longer comprehend. The turning point arrived not with a single battle, but with the sheer accumulation of output. Every month, the Luftwaffe lost hundreds of fighters. Every month, America produced thousands more. Roosevelt's prophecy, once derided as madness, became a statistical weapon. By mid-1943, the 8th Air Force controlled the daylight skies over Europe. In the Pacific, carrier-based aircraft, mass-produced and endlessly replaced, turned naval warfare into aerial dominance. The factories of Kansas and California dictated the fates of cities half a world away. This was not just industry at war, it was industry as war. Each bomber wing that rose from British airfields carried the hum of Detroit behind it, the precision of California draftsmen, the resolve of women in overalls. The American sky was now weaponized. But the climb to dominance had not yet peaked. The storm still gathered force, for in 1944 production would reach its zenith, and the myth of American propaganda would finally collapse under its own roaring truth. By 1944, the roar of engines had become the soundtrack of the world. The American war machine was no longer expanding, it was exploding. Every hour, new aircraft left assembly lines. Every day, trains and convoys rolled toward the coasts, carrying wings, engines, propellers, and men. Airfields sprang up across England like metallic cities. The air itself was heavy with movement, the constant thrum of power that had no precedent in history. From the English countryside, villagers looked up to see the sky covered in geometry, bomber formations stretching for miles, precision in motion. The B-17s and B-24s that filled those skies were no longer symbols of hope. They were instruments of inevitability. Roosevelt's promise of 300,000 aircraft was now more than prophecy. It was arithmetic. By the end of 1944, America had produced nearly 275,000 aircraft, with another 20,000 on the way. The factories that Germany once mocked had surpassed every projection. Production reports stunned even Washington. The impossible had been achieved, ahead of schedule. This industrial crescendo converged with military strategy. The Allies prepared for Operation Overlord, the D-Day invasion of Normandy. Air supremacy was its prerequisite, and America delivered it in overwhelming form. More than 11,000 aircraft supported the operation: fighters, bombers, transports, gliders. A storm of metal above the French coast. German soldiers on the ground described the sky as solid with planes. Luftwaffe units that attempted to intervene were swept aside. Their airfields, fuel depots and communication centers had been obliterated months before. By dawn on June 6, 1944, the Germans could count only a handful of operational squadrons. This was the full weight of Roosevelt's prophecy. The Reich, once defined by its efficiency, was now crushed by a democracy that had mastered scale. Inside German command centers, disbelief turned to silence. Göring, who once mocked America's propaganda, now faced the unthinkable. Reports arrived from every front, losses in the thousands, pilots outnumbered 20-1, fuel reserves drained. He admitted privately that the Luftwaffe was no longer an air force but a memory. Over the next months, American aircraft became an omnipresent force. B-17s bombed Berlin in daylight, a feat thought suicidal only a year before. P-51 Mustangs escorted them all the way and back, refueled and repaired faster than Germany could even respond. The skies above Europe no longer belonged to the Reich. They belonged to the machine Roosevelt had built. The contrast was total. German aircraft production, still impressive under Albert Speer's management, could not overcome the material chokehold. America's reach was too vast, its system too flexible. When bombers hit a plant in one state, others increased output overnight. No single raid could cripple the American supply chain. It was too distributed, too redundant, too alive. In January 1945, as Allied forces crossed the Rhine, America's aircraft count surpassed 300,000. The number that began as propaganda had become a monument, one built not of marble, but of rivets and faith. Every sector of the war bore its mark. In the Pacific, fleets of B-29 superfortresses turned Japanese industry into ash. In Europe, bombers paved the way for advancing armies. The air no longer belonged to combatants, it belonged to production. The victory did not belong to one general or one strategy. It belonged to a collective. The engineers, riveters, welders, pilots, planners, millions unified by a single vision uttered 4 years earlier by a man many had doubted. On the first day of 1945, Roosevelt addressed Congress. His voice, weakened but unwavering, carried through radios across the world. "We have built more than weapons. We have built confidence, the confidence of free men who know that nothing is impossible." In Berlin, as the bombers came again, the echo of that sentence seemed to fill the air before the sound of explosions did. The prophecy had become the weapon, and the weapon had reshaped history. The war in the air was won. But what followed, the wreckage, the numbers, the human cost, would reveal what that victory truly meant. By mid-1945, the noise had quieted. The machines still stood, but the sky they once filled was now empty, a silence built from victory. The numbers were staggering. Between 1940 and 1945, the United States produced 300,317 aircraft. Fighters, bombers, transports, trainers, enough to replace the entire Luftwaffe, more than 10 times over. Factories that had been fields 5 years earlier were now cities of steel. The scale of it defied belief. More than 700 airframes completed every day, an aircraft taking flight every 5 minutes. No other nation in history had ever attempted such output. None had even imagined it possible. In Germany, the aftermath was ruin. Allied bombing had erased entire industries. Cities like Hamburg, Dresden and Cologne were reduced to skeletal grids of stone and ash. Luftwaffe airfields were graveyards of wreckage, twisted wings, shattered engines, burned fuselages. The once proud symbol of Nazi power now existed only in fragments scattered across the countryside. When American and British troops entered captured air bases, they found half-finished prototypes. Desperate innovations born too late. Jet interceptors, rocket fighters, suicide weapons. They were marvels of desperation, evidence that the Third Reich had run out of time, fuel, and faith. Roosevelt's propaganda number had destroyed not just the Luftwaffe, but the myth that authoritarian efficiency could outmatch democratic will. In Washington, the War Production Board began compiling the final reports. At its peak, the American aircraft industry employed over 2 million workers. Raw material consumption was almost beyond accounting. 5 million tons of aluminum, 30 million tires, billions of gallons of aviation fuel. Entire cities had risen around the supply chain. The industrial geography of the nation had been rewritten. Economists later called it the production miracle, but for those who lived it, it was simply necessity, the physical manifestation of survival. And it had cost dearly. More than 88,000 American airmen were killed in action during World War II. Thousands more were captured or missing. Each bomber that left its hangar carried human lives into the storm. The sky had been both the weapon and the grave. Yet, for all its tragedy, the transformation of American industry left something permanent. The same plants that built bombers would soon build airliners. The same engineers who designed the B-29 would go on to design the first jet transports. Wartime necessity had birthed a technological civilization. Across the Atlantic, German scientists and engineers captured by the Allies marveled at what they saw. The sheer coordination of production, the depth of logistics, the democratic efficiency of scale. They did not outfight us, one Luftwaffe officer admitted. They outbuilt us. Roosevelt did not live to see the end. He died in April 1945, just weeks before victory in Europe. His dream had outlasted him, not as a speech, but as machinery, as the thunder of wings across two oceans. The factories kept running even after the surrender. Aircraft stored in rows stretched to the horizon, their paint gleaming in the summer light. Thousands would never fly again. Some were scrapped, others sold for a fraction of their worth. But for a brief moment, the United States stood as something entirely new, an industrial empire without rival, its production capacity vast enough to rebuild or destroy the world. The war had proven something greater than strategy or weapons. It had proven what a free society could achieve when forced to fight for its existence. The question now was what it would do with that power. The war had ended, but the consequences, economic, political, and psychological, were only beginning to unfold. The summer of 1945 carried the scent of victory and exhaustion. Across America, workers who had spent half a decade inside hangars and assembly lines began returning home. For the first time in years, the factory lights dimmed. The endless hum of engines and rivet guns faded. Yet the shadow of what had been built lingered. Those same factories, once symbols of urgency, now stood as monuments to an industrial awakening that had changed the nation's identity. The United States was no longer just a democracy, it was a superpower, forged in aluminum and fuel. The 300,000 aircraft had not just won the war, they had built the infrastructure of global dominance. In the ashes of Europe and the Pacific, only America retained both the means and the will to lead. What Roosevelt had demanded in 1940 as a goal of survival became, by 1945, the blueprint of supremacy. The wartime economy did not collapse as many feared. Instead, it evolved. Factories transitioned from bombers to civilian aircraft, tanks to tractors, weapons to machines of peace. The same assembly lines that had filled the skies now filled the homes of a booming post-war society. Jobs did not vanish, they transformed. The arsenal of democracy had become the arsenal of prosperity. Across the Atlantic, the world lay divided. The Soviet Union, its factories rebuilt in blood and ruin, began its own production race. But the gap was already immense. American industry could produce not only weapons, but abundance. Its military capacity was not dismantled. It was institutionalized. In 1947, the U.S. Air Force became an independent branch. Within 2 years, the Berlin airlift proved that Roosevelt's legacy had outgrown war itself. Aircraft now served not to destroy, but to sustain. Over 277,000 flights carried supplies into a blockaded city, turning air power into diplomacy. The lessons of the 300,000 airplanes became doctrine: speed, scale, adaptation. Wars were no longer won only on battlefields, but in production schedules and logistics chains. Historians later called it industrial warfare's final evolution. Roosevelt had not merely built planes, he had built a system that could rebuild the world. But there was another cost, one harder to measure. The relentless drive for production had altered the American psyche. Efficiency became identity. Mass became meaning. The machine had proven its supremacy, and humanity began to orbit it. In cities like Detroit and Seattle, where once the factories had roared, silence felt unnatural. The men and women who had built the aircraft struggled to find purpose in peace. Many would say the war ended, but the momentum never did. Germany, now divided and occupied, watched the skies it once claimed as its own filled with American patrols. The irony was complete. The same aircraft production the Nazis dismissed as propaganda now enforced their surrender. In 1946, a report from the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey summarized it simply: the enemy did not fall from the air, he was buried beneath it. The report noted that by the final year of the war, Germany could produce only 10% of America's monthly aircraft output. The Luftwaffe's strength was no longer determined by pilots or fuel, but by the numbers Roosevelt had once announced as an ideal. It was proof of something larger than military arithmetic. It was proof that ideas, even those dismissed as fantasy, could reshape the world if the will behind them held steady. The airfields that once sent bombers into the sky would soon launch jetliners, satellites, and rockets. From the same logic that built the B-17 came the engines that carried men into space. The prophecy of 300,000 planes had fulfilled itself, and then transcended its purpose. The numbers had ended a war. But their meaning, what they revealed about mankind's capacity, ambition, and danger, would echo long after. The story of Roosevelt's 300,000 planes is not only the story of a war won, it is the story of what human conviction can build when pressed to its absolute edge. In 1940, it was a statement dismissed as fantasy, a politician's flourish, a number designed to inspire morale. But by 1945, that number had materialized into steel, flight, and firepower on a scale the world had never witnessed. It was more than production, it was transformation. A nation of citizens became a singular organism. Engineers, welders, pilots, mechanics, all synchronized toward survival. America's geography became an engine. Its democracy became a factory. And from that machine rose something greater than victory, a new definition of possibility. The Germans called it propaganda because they could not imagine its reality. They underestimated not the factories, but the faith behind them. The belief that purpose, once unified, could multiply into matter. Yet the lesson is double-edged. What Roosevelt unleashed was proof of both creation and consequence. The power that built those aircraft also built the nuclear age. The same production philosophy that lifted a nation from despair made it capable of annihilation. The 300,000 planes became the foundation of a century defined by industry without limits, the age of the machine as destiny. Standing decades later, their remnants rest in museums and deserts, faded paint, rusting Huawei. NGS, silent witnesses to a moment when humanity reached beyond imagination and touched its own extremes. They remind us that wars are not won by numbers alone, but by will, and that the line between creation and destruction is as thin as the metal skin of a bomber at altitude. Roosevelt's prophecy did not end with victory. It became the template for every technological leap that followed: jet flight, space travel, digital industry. Each one traces its lineage back to the moment when a president refused to accept limitation. In the silence after the engines stopped, one truth remained. Faith in the impossible had become the blueprint of the modern world. And history, forever changed by it, would never doubt America's capacity again.